Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. Friends, today's conversation is really about committing to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our fundraising efforts in the sector. And by the way, that means also in our fundraising efforts in our organization. So, just want to be clear about that. Today, also, as part of this, we are breaking barriers with Kia Croom, who is a powerhouse. She has transformed fundraising through her unwavering commitment to equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. If you have ever wondered how to meaningfully integrate these into your fundraising strategy, this conversation is a must listen. Kia is a disruptor in the nonprofit realm, standing out by challenging the status quo. She has over 2 decades of expertise in fundraising. By the way, raised over $500 million in 2 decades, not something many of us who have been fundraisers can say. And she has, in doing that, masterfully assisted people of color-led organizations in propelling their missions and their movements. Let me share with you just a few more of her philanthropic achievements. In addition to raising over $500 million for diverse causes, spanning from STEM to housing and homelessness to youth development and HIV/AIDS, she also has experience in grant writing, major gifts, content creation, digital marketing, and more. In today's conversation, you are going to see that she is a champion of racial equity. Deeply rooted in promoting philanthropic justice, Kia's work intersects equity, diversity, inclusion, and more. She is dedicated to addressing anti-Black racism, championing Black-led nonprofits and businesses. Also, I would be remiss if I did not say she is a proud alumnus of Clark Atlanta University and HBCU. Hey, Kia, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, man, thank you. What a wonderful intro. Thank you.
Thank you. And in doing research for this episode, I know that for you, 2020 was a pivotal year. And if you could share with our friends who are listening, and then maybe that's a good jumping off point for our conversation.
Yeah. In 2020, I, like a lot of folks, was working full time, learning what it meant to work remotely. I remember, like a lot of people, the little weirdness, feeling kind of disconnected from your colleagues and, the folks you were working with because we weren't in the office. I remember it like it was yesterday, March of 2020. I think my last work day was like March 10th. And yeah, my last work day in anybody's office was March 10th. And I remember hearing about this pandemic that was coming, right? And didn't really know what that meant for me or for anybody for that matter. But one thing that I remember like nothing else was the concerns I had around what this remote work environment would feel like. Would it feel the way that it felt when I was in the office, for instance? Some of the dynamics that I dealt with regard to racial discrimination or racial trauma or microaggressions, like I remember thinking, okay, feeling a little relieved that I didn't have to go in the office. I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to say that I felt very relieved that I didn't have to go in the office and deal head on with some of those dynamics. But I wondered would they rear their ugly head in the remote environment, right? Or would I have a reprieve from some of that? And relatively quickly, I learned that, yeah, they absolutely would continue. Was it as pronounced as it was when I was in the office? Yeah. Was it easier to deal with working remotely where I could hide behind Zoom or, try to get an escape? Yeah, but it was still there, right? What am I talking about? I'm talking about the lack of inclusion that I was experiencing at the intersection of my race and gender. And it really changed my life and changed how I viewed this fight. I mean, it wasn't going to go away despite the fact that I was working from home, as were millions of other people. It was still very much there, and it was still very unpleasant.
You mentioned the lack of inclusion in the virtual environment. How was it similar to, and how is that lack of inclusion different from the in-person work environment?
Very similar in the fact, I mean, the personalities were the same. The microaggressions were the same. The only thing that changed was I wasn't sitting across the table or across the desk from the person that was perpetrating those harms, right? I was sitting across a Zoom screen. The microaggressions or the exclusionary behaviors that I had experienced pre-pandemic, I continue to experience them, whether they meant being left off of emails, whether it meant not necessarily receiving information that I needed to, effectively do my job. I mean, these kinds of things were still happening. And I knew if these things were still happening to me and I was home, as were millions of other people, right? But still felt the weight, the trauma, the humiliation, that there had to be other people that felt the exact same way I did. And maybe they hadn't been verbal about it, probably for the same reasons that I hadn't, which were rooted in fear.
That different experience in the virtual environment changed you in some way.
It did. It really brought home the fact that, okay, this has been your lived experience with workplace racial trauma in person. You show up. It's like I explained to someone once, imagine you have two bowls, like two fish bowls, and one is full of marbles. And every time you're microaggressed or you're humiliated, it takes marbles out of your bowl. So you take some marbles out of one fish bowl and you drop them in the other, right? Experiencing that day to day, you'd be surprised how quickly, those marbles accumulate in that empty fish bowl, right? And here I am, excited and happy. I was terribly happy that I didn't have to get on a train or get on a bus and go into the office to be treated that way, right? But quickly learned that it was going to persist even in the virtual work environment.
One of the things that I just thought about, that shame on me, I not thought about it this way. Part of the difference I also think is you used to have to get on a train or a bus or a car to commute in. Now you're experiencing that in your own home.
Yeah.
Did that change how home felt at all?
I don't think it changed how home felt. I grew up believing that home was that sacred place, right? Home represents a place where I'm safe and I can recharge. It represents a place that's familiar, a place where I can disrobe. I still enjoy that, right? I underestimated how pronounced those experiences are even in the virtual environment. I even read somewhere that some women of color felt like it was even worse, right, in the virtual environment than in person. And I remember feeling like, okay, I'm not going to invalidate anybody else's experience, but there was a little bit more cover that I felt like I could enjoy being as though I was home. Didn't necessarily feel worse, but it sure in the hell didn't feel much better, right? And even though I wasn't sitting across the table or across a desk or a partition, a cubicle from a perpetrator live and in the flesh. I still very much felt the blows. It didn't soften any of the blows. And it was still difficult for me early into 2020, as outspoken as I am, it was still a little difficult to find the words to confront those behaviors. And I'm pretty outspoken.
One of the things I know from your videos and your website and your podcast is you did find words to confront the perpetrators, to confront the behavior. How did you find those words?
You know, I really think that it had all the world to do with that epiphany that I had that, okay, it can't just be me. And I mean, you've got to be kidding me. You know, the world is upended. Folks are food insecure. People are dying from a disease that, I mean, you remember, like, you go back to 2020, early into 2020, you were diagnosed with COVID. Folks were praying that you weren't going to go home to be with the Lord, because it was really, for some people, you know, it was really very deadly. And here I am thinking, you know, all of this is going on in the world, and I'm still being minimized. I'm still being humiliated. I'm showing up to work and trying to find the motivation to do what I do every day. I'm darn good at it. I love what I do. And yet I'm not immune from this happening to me. I'm good at what I do. I love what I do. I'm impactful at what I do. And this is happening to me. So for someone who might not have necessarily looked at their self and all the value that they bring to an organization, all of the hard work and dedication that they're pouring into their job, somebody who might have been second guessing themselves and might have been experiencing the same behaviors, might have been looking inwardly and thought that something was wrong with them, when in actuality, no, it's the construct and the work culture you're working in, right? So if it was happening to me, it could be happening to anybody else. And it just wasn't a time to be silent about it anymore. It was time to put words to paper and talk about what I was seeing and what I was experiencing.
And so let's talk about those words to paper. When you did really use your voice, what have you been working on for the last couple of 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, so it's interesting now that I look back and I think about all of the things that were in my head in 2020, right? I'm a frontline fundraiser. I wanted to find my tribe, right? I wanted to find other women that might have been feeling the same way that I was feeling, other Black women. I wanted to find other Black men, you know, in my community, working in fundraising, working in philanthropy. And I wanted them to know that they weren't alone. I wanted them to know that if no one else heard them, if no one else saw them, that I did, right? And something interesting happened to me. I started doing some executive coaching, and it changed my life. Reason being, and I'm going to answer your question, but I thought that this was important to share. When I embarked on my executive coaching, I coached with a lady named Danette Sudiv. She's a white lady, senior executive. And in my work with Danette, I was finally able to really understand the value that I bring to the table, not just professionally, not just having gone to school and, you know, earned degrees and things of that nature, but the lived experience that I have as a person that lived in poverty, right? The lived experience that I have as a Black woman who has experienced education inequity, who has experienced health inequities, right? I really began to look at the totality of who I am and what I have to offer an organization, right? I tapped into what folks call edge, right? And I really didn't know it. I never understood, I never knew, but finally understanding what it means, to have an edge. It's like, okay, this is my edge. I haven't just been working and growing and developing in this space. Like, I've lived through and survived some things, right? So I wanted other Black fundraisers and even fundraisers of color to know, you know what? In a sector where everyone hangs on your educational attainment, what you've published, I want you to understand that if you're a person that survived something and you're working in a space to create resolutions for it, that's incredibly valuable, if not more valuable than the degrees that a lot of us are still paying for. Your lived experience, the things that you saw, the things that you survived, there's nothing that anybody should be able to tell you about it. And instead of being ashamed of those experiences and those humble beginnings, as a lot of people point back to or think back to, harness those as a strength, right? And don't ever be ashamed of what life has given you, because that is the lens through which you navigate the world and you draw your motivation and impetus for what you do. And nobody should ever be able to take that from you.
I kind of want to add, but instead I'm going to ask you, what I wanted to add was, and also hold out for premium pay for your lived experience. Like, that's the piece I wanted to add. But then I was like, maybe I should ask instead.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because I'm a big proponent of people of color holding out, right? And demanding what they are owed, what they are due, right? I want to respond fully to your question. What have I been doing over the last couple of years? So it took me having that epiphany about who I am and the triumphs that I've achieved personally and privately, like being, a first gen that broke a cycle of generational poverty. I mean, a cycle that perpetuated itself for years. In my family, it stopped with me, right? I looked at what can I do to prepare the next generation of people who think and feel the way that I feel, right? Or what can I do even in this moment to equip other people who feel the way that I feel, who have some of the same lived experiences as me? How can I help them to better do what they're doing? Whether they're working as fundraisers, whether they're working as executives, what can I share that might lend itself to helping you be a better executive or a better fundraiser? And I started the Black Fundraisers podcast, and it was all about elevating the voices of Black professionals in that space, right? In a space where I want to say for the last 15 years of my 22-year career, I had become accustomed to seeing white men and women dominate this space, right? I remember when it wasn't even as diverse as it is now. And I decided to create a platform for people who look like me in that space to just come on and tell their stories, to give voice to them and the wonderful work they're doing.
What are some of the threads that run through those stories?
Sure. So the common threads are experiences with inequity, experiences with what I call workplace racial trauma, experiences with being othered, experiences with being gaslit, experiences with this deep, unwavering commitment to make a difference despite of those experiences. Despite the fact that I'm showing up at a job, right? For those that were showing up, for those who are still going into the office, right? Because the world has since opened back up. I met people that are doing incredible work that's changing communities in spite of or despite, the workplace racial trauma they deal with. A common thread is the fact that despite what they might have experienced growing up, whether it was sexual abuse, whether it was having a parent that might have been addicted to drugs, or being systems impacted and having a parent, have been incarcerated, losing a mother or a father during the war on drugs, you name it, right? There's this unwavering commitment to saving somebody else. That is a very common thread, right? Seeing people of color, and there's research been done on this, that we tend to go into these roles based on our desire, this intrinsic motivation to do something about the inequities and the indignations we've dealt with, right? I've met people that have worked in pursuit of that, even at the expense of their own comfort and even safety. When we talk about psychological safety, those are some of the common threads that I remember.
I'm putting myself in the heads of some of our friends who listen. And I can hear them being like, Dolph, you need to ask this question. So I think many of our listeners are probably asking, okay, if we're a leader in a nonprofit organization, what do we do? Or how do we ensure that our fundraising departments, that our organizations are breaking down barriers, are essentially creating not just an inclusive workforce, but an inclusive leadership. So, the senior leadership team, and I will say, I see this all the time with nonprofits. I look at the senior leadership team, there's 7 or 8 people on it, and 6 or 7 of them are white, and one of them is a person of color. And then I look at the staff, and 80% of the staff are people of color, or 60% of the staff are people of color. So I can see our listeners asking the question, what do we do to break down those barriers to really create a more diverse leadership, and not in a generation, not in 10 years, but now?
Yeah, it really starts with those leaders getting honest. What are the quality of the experiences here for people of color, right? It requires those white male executives, those cisgendered white men, to look inward and understand, okay, I'm incredibly privileged, right? In any opportunity that I have within this organization to lay my status down and listen to the voices and consider the lived experiences of other people, I've got to acknowledge that I've got to give up some power, right? Nobody wants to give up power. Let's just be honest. Nobody wants to give up power, but it requires those leaders to do that and really look at what are these quality of experiences like for Black women, for Black men, for Latin women, for Latin men, for Indigenous workers, right? When we think about racial and ethnic minorities, I don't want to leave out historically minoritized social groups, but here's my thinking. When we get it right for Black and brown people, I think we've got it right for everybody. I really believe that in my heart of hearts. And it's going to take those leaders to lean in, give up some of that power, and hear some things that they don't necessarily want to hear and learn.
So I have two follow-up questions for you, and we might not get to the second one, and that's okay. And the reason I say we might not is we might go in a different direction. But one of the things you said that I think is really important, and I want to hear more about it, is leaders laying down some of their status. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so laying down your status, it looks like, let's say there's a meeting, and this meeting could be in person or it could be in a virtual environment. The leader should be the last respondent. If a question's on the table, it's incumbent upon that leader not to, jump the gun and insert his, her, or their perspectives, but to listen to that of others and understanding if I jump out here and share my premise or my position on this, whatever the topic is, it may cause somebody to self-censure and not really honestly and authentically report out or share, right? So laying down status could be as simple as not sharing until the end, right? And listening to the feedback of others, whether it's your subordinates, whether it's mid-level, entry-level, whoever it is. That's one example.
I could also see listeners saying, okay, I want my organization to go on a journey where we confront our privilege. And a lot of our listeners are in a position to help their organization go on that journey because they're the executive director or they're the board chair. And I know the journey looks different for each organization, but what does the general framework look like?
It doesn't have to be complicated. At the core of this, we're talking about inclusion. Inclusion is a relational construct that really deals with the quality of relationships within an organization, right? Within an organism. It really deals with how do Dolph and Kia interact? What opportunities are there for Dolph to experience Kia and learn about her and her motivations and her background, right? The idea is we know that everyone has these prejudices, right? Everyone has biases. When those prejudices and biases couple with power is where they're problematic. When you can keep somebody from accessing an opportunity or keep someone in the margins, where their voices aren't heard, right? We're talking about that power dynamic. So what is at the root of this is inclusion, and a leader that wants to get this right. It's easier said than done, but I believe that it's really very simple. This inclusive leader, this leader that aspires to be more inclusive, should create opportunities for folks to learn and experience one another. And the ideal is that in doing so, you create space for people to replace that automatic processing that fuels their prejudices, right? Like I've got braids down to my derriere. I consider these fingernails that I'm wearing pretty short. They're usually long, right? I wear big earrings, right? And red lipstick and do things that Black women aren't supposed to do by somebody's standard, like wear blonde hair and things, right? Because we know I'm a disruptor and I challenge norms. Inclusion posits that despite the fact that we're different, there's really things about us that are alike. And if we have the opportunity to establish like that shared ground, you'll get me better and I'll get you better, right? You shared with me that you yourself are not an HBCU alum, but your father's an HBCU alum, right? You shared with me that you are a queer male, right? You have lived experience with inequity, right? You talked to me about how you remember a time when, as a queer male, it was like, I remember, how the bad word was, being gay, right? I mean, it was, and I also remember the stigma that came with being gay or homosexual with the rise of the AIDS HIV epidemic, right? I remember it was just, you're gay, you die from AIDS, and that's it, right? That's what I remember hearing as a little girl growing up in the 80s. Why did I say all of that? I said all of that to say this. You sat down with me and you shared some deeply personal things with me that did a couple of things. It drove down status, right? I could have assumed you were another cisgendered white male, like I tend to encounter, that digs the work that I do, but doesn't necessarily feel it relates to them because I'm not racist. I have Black friends and I work with Black people. You shared some things with me about yourself that gave windows to who you are and what your journey has been like. I feel like, and research shows, when we create situations like that in the workplace, whether it's the 5 or 10 minutes you get on the Zoom early, people get on Zoom 5-6 minutes early, talk about your weekend, right? If we talk about an exercise, it could be an exercise where everyone brings their baby picture, and talks about why they chose this particular baby picture. My favorite baby picture is me. I had to be about 7 months old with a strawberry shortcake dress on, right? Just a little fat Black baby girl with little, braids, little plaits and barrettes with a strawberry shortcake outfit on. I can't show you that picture without telling a little bit about my story, where I come from, how I lived, right? So it just takes us being able to do that and being able to lay everything aside and just be present and be human beings. And we'll find that we have more in common and a shared humanity than we do have differences.
So, Kia, if an organization goes on this journey, and I realize it's a journey that doesn't end. So, so it's not like I can say, and they get it right, because the journey does not end. But if an organization goes on this journey and they're headed in the right direction, well, let's just say that, what could their fundraising department look like in 5 years? And what could their organization look like in 5 years?
I mean, it's transformative. If an organization commits to this journey and doing the internal work that it needs to do and honors the diverse perspectives and lived experiences held by its workers, especially those persons of color, those historically minoritized racial and social groups, and everyone feels as though they're welcomed at the table and they're valued for their uniqueness. There's this unbridled diversity of thought that I could see happening. There's this fearlessness that I see, like this liberation that would allow people to freely share their ideas. They're not afraid of being impugned. They're not afraid of being fired. They're supportive of one another. They champion one another. They create a container of norms that honor diversity, right? That honor individuality. They show up for one another. They defend one another and protect one another. I think that it would be incredible. I think that this organization that buys into this will produce some pretty transformative work that would enable them to reach and resonate with donors in a way that they'd never imagined. I believe that.
I love that. I love that vision. Kia, I know we're doing this at Cause Camp, and it's late. It's 6 minutes to 6. You've had a long day. You've presented today, and you've had a long day. So I definitely want to be respectful of your time. Also want to give us the opportunity to do the off the map question, which does help people like get to know each other a little bit better. And well, everyone has different experiences. It breaks down barriers. Even when it's a similar experience, I understand that we experience it differently. So I know that you have a similar experience to a lot of other moms, and that you have just sent a child off to college. That's not something I've ever done. So I'm hoping that you're going to share with me what it's like for you to send your child off to college.
Oh my God. Sending my son off to college marks the end of an era for me. And that might sound weird to somebody. It's like, okay, it's the end. It's the end of one, but it's the beginning of another. And understand why I say that. I have parented my son single-handedly since he was 2 weeks old. I'm a domestic violence survivor. I'm not ashamed to say that. And I learned when he was 2 weeks old that enough was enough, and that was it, right? And made a decision that I wasn't gonna have an element of abuse in my household any longer. I survived a very violent pregnancy and was fortunate that, you know, I had this beautiful, healthy baby boy, and I was going to do whatever it took to keep us both safe. So it had been just he and I for the last 18 years. And when I look back over, you know, all those days, because I mean, you work in a nonprofit sector, you know, the pay ain't always the greatest, okay? You know, a sister wasn't making, you know, mega bucks over the years, right? But I was able to be present. You know, I was able to go to his baseball games and all of those wonderful things that, you know, you do with your adolescent kids. When I say it's the end of an era, it's one of those things that I'd always talk to him about was, you know, I want you to get educated. I want you to go to school. What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? What kind of impact? Getting him to this juncture in a world where he can't wear a hoodie, right? I don't allow my son to wear a hoodie and walk around outside. And we live in a great suburban neighborhood. His friends can wear hoodies, right? But he knows why I don't. You know, I think about Trayvon Martin, right? Getting him to that point in a world where people adultify Black boys and call them thugs. You know, they talk about gang culture and had he been in my construct of East Oakland, he might have had some criminal history. Having an adult Black male that has no criminal history, no gang affiliations, that's, you know, doing all of these wonderful things that society doesn't celebrate, right, is like, I can't even put it into words, and knowing that, you know, I helped him to get there. And I'm going to tell you, what's even more gratifying than that is being able to pay for him to go there, like writing that first check for his tuition. When my mother, when I went off to college, I remember she sewed up a quilt and gave me a suitcase, and she never made it to my institution. My dad never made it to my institution. He passed right before graduation, like maybe 3 months, you know? So going from that experience to being able to get him to college, move him in the dorm, you know, pay his tuition and make sure that he's set up for success is something that I never even imagined. Like, I prayed for days like this where I would be able to make sure all of his needs were met. And I'm just so grateful. And he's just really, really making me proud. He's really making me proud of him. So proud of my baby boy.
Kia, thank you for sharing that. I feel like I was on part of that journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Friends, you know, it's always important that you're able to reach out to our guest. And so let me share with you 2 ways you can connect with Kia. First, you can go to our website at kiacroom.com. When you go there, there's a few things you should be looking for. First of all, check out her videos. She's got some great YouTube videos. You're going to want to check those out. Second of all, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned the Black Fundraising Podcast. And you can also access the Black Fundraising Podcast at kiacroom.com as well. Also be sure that you check out fundraisinginblack.org. In either of those two, you can find Kia and you can also connect with her. Additionally, you can find ways that you could invite Kia to speak at an event. You can engage her for consulting, etc. You can also do that at kiacroom.com. And I would strongly encourage you, if you have an event coming up, to consider it. Kia, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It means a lot.
All right, friends. So I'm going to have 2 asks of you. The very first thing I'm going to ask is, please rate and review this podcast. It's easy to do. Pick up your phone, open it up, and give it some stars. Just give the podcast some stars. If you especially like this podcast, write a review. But I have a second podcast to ask for you today, and that's, I also want you to check out the Black Fundraisers Podcast. So make sure that you check that out as well. Again, open up your phone. You already have your podcast streamer open because I know you just rated this podcast. So open up your phone, click search, and look for Black Fundraisers Podcast. You will find Kia's podcast. I think she just recently finished the 2nd season. And so you can binge season 1 and season 2 while you're waiting for season 3 to come out. If you like this episode, there's 2 more I want you to check out. The first is episode 265, Become a Competitive and Equitable Employer with Kevin Dean. The second is episode 216, Women in Nonprofits with Jess Cooper. And that, my friends, is our show for the week. I hope that you have gained some insight to help you and your nonprofit thrive. And unfortunately, one of the constructs that we live in is that the lawyers make me say this at the end of every episode. Even though we talked about nothing, I think, that has to do with law or accounting, let me tell you, I'm not an accountant, nor am I an attorney. And neither I, nor the consulting practice, nor this podcast provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This podcast, my friends, I say it every week, it's for informational purposes only. Whose information? Your information. This is for your informational purposes. And you should not rely on it for tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please, for everything that you love, if you need tax, legal, or accounting advice, find a licensed, qualified professional in your area.